Good afternoon, everybody. I want to welcome you all to the 21st Lipsett lecture. Just a few words about Dr. Lipsett, who was really a unique individual. I only got to know him the year that he was sick, unfortunately, 1985. I was a student at the time. Dr. Lipsett, I think, is the only NIH leader who was both twice two institutes director, and then became a CRC director in between. So he was at the Arthritis and Diabetes Digestive Kidney Diseases Institute, which was at the time one, then CRC director, and then NICHD director, or something along these lines. But anyway, I don't think there has ever been another NIH leader that has held three senior posts consecutively. And that is a testimony to his skills, both as a scientist, as an educator, a mentor, and a successful administrator. So for 21 years now, we have been celebrating his memory with this annual lecture. And it is the third time in 3 consecutive years that we have quite appropriately dedicated this lecture to a speaker who comes from the generic world of reproductive medicine. So for our speaker today, I'll invite Dr. DeCherney, who is going to introduce our speaker.
This will be a little different introduction. Sally's an old friend of mine, and I know him very well. And I'm not going to say he has multiple publications and multiple honors, and it's all true. But let me just trace his career for a moment. He was a medical student in Israel, the Sackler Medical School, then came to Tufts at the United States to be a obstetrics and gynecology resident. From there, he went on to his fellowship. Actually, his fellowship occurred in 2 very distinguished places in the reproductive endocrine world, where he worked with 2 very distinguished gentlemen, Dr. Howard Jones and Dr. Sam Yen, one at Hopkins and the other at UCSD. From there, he went on to Maryland, where he was a chief of the division of reproductive endocrine. He went to Utah and then Brown, where he is now. He's made major impact on our field, and he'll go into those areas, mainly in his last life, because very strangely, he's had a tripartite, not sequential, yes, I guess sequential career. He's gone from a physician to a funded researcher, to an administrator when he was the chairman of the department, and the dean at Brown, and to now he's a well-respected, extremely prolific ethicist and editorialist. We'll hear about his editorial work, but just one thing that he was extremely important in the field of reproductive endocrine is that he was one of the people that kind of raised the flag and brought everybody's attention in a theoretical way to twinning or the high rate of multiples in vitro fertilization. So I think that was his first attempt at changing policy, and obviously it's become tremendously successful. We have Dr. Stillman in the audience, who was an activist as far as that was concerned. So it's a pleasure for me to introduce Ellie as our Lipsett speaker, and I know what he's going to say, and it's good.
Thank you. Dr. Stratakis, Dr. DeCherney, and friends, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for the privilege of allowing me to join you in recognizing the memory of Dr. Mortimer B. Lipsett. As was already briefly mentioned and is widely recognized, and appropriately so. Dr. Lipsett is frequently lauded for his multiple leadership roles at the NIH, as the director of the Clinical Center, as the director of NICHD, and as the director of NIA-DDK. That alone, however, hardly takes a full measure of the man who was also a scientist of the highest order, whose papers saw press on the pages of Science, the New England Journal of Medicine, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, to name a few. A feat that he accomplished early on by close collaboration with Dr. Roy Hertz, and later on in close partnership with Dr. Griff Ross, and later on Dr. Lynn Loriot. Looking back, there can be little doubt but that over the 1960 to 95 interval, essentially a quarter of a century, Dr. Lipsett oversaw a veritable transformation of endocrinology, both at the NIH and inevitably worldwide. And when I say endocrinology, I mean adult endocrinology, pediatric endocrinology, and reproductive endocrinology. Since I did not have the privilege of meeting Dr. Lipsett in person, I reached out to former colleagues and trainees with an eye towards securing their recollections. And I wish to take this opportunity to thank them all for their generous time allocation. And while I cannot do complete justice to this record, I would like to cite a few select, indeed recurring quotes that came about in the course of these conversations. Supreme intellect, best clinician ever encountered, great mentor, and consummate scientist. It does not get much better than that. With your permission, I would like to begin our conversation with an infographic produced by the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, which I imagine many of you know is arguably the premier bioethics enterprise in the United Kingdom. What the Nuffield Council sought to do was to lay out as best as possible what's on the horizon for bioethics. And it is, as you can see, a busy scene indeed. Limiting ourselves for the moment to human reproduction, the Nuffield Council lists in vitro-derived gametes, time limits on maintaining embryos in culture, womb replacement, preconception screening, whole genome sequencing of embryos and fetuses, genome editing of gametes and embryos, and egg freezing, all of which clearly qualify under the description or the descriptor as emerging reproductive technologies, which invariably are associated with significant ethical challenges, as well as substantial societal concerns that have everything to do with public acceptance of these technologies. None of this, of course, applies to so-called somatic technologies. Take recombinant factor VIII as an example. the adjudicatory process of which is essentially a transactional affair that focuses solely on compliance with regulatory requirements. As you know, such process usually begins with an investigation on new drug application to the FDA such that clinical trials can ensue, followed eventually by a new drug application or biologics license application such that the approval process could be initiated, after which time an expert FDA advisory committee is likely to be convened to discuss safety and efficacy, in the course of which there will be relatively little time and opportunity for the articulation of either public support or opposition. Shortly thereafter, the matter will be handed off back to the FDA staff, initially for deliberation and eventually for a decision. However, reproductive technologies are markedly different than their somatic counterparts. And that is, like it or not, they are inextricably enmeshed with notions that are essential to the fabric of humanity, such as gender, sexuality, heritability, societal mores, and religious precepts. Apart and distinct from these matters, reproductive technologies invariably run up against the national schism over reproductive rights. There is no reason to expect that emerging reproductive technologies are going to fare any better. And to ignore history in this context is, in a sense, to deny it. The first oral contraceptive, Anavid, was tried in the courts of law and public opinion prior to its actualization. In vitro fertilization was subjected to intense, at times vicious, public, professional, and doctrinal opposition prior to its materialization. And the switch from prescription-only to over-the-counter status of Plan B was held up for 12 years until a federal court ruling saw to its realization. As I mentioned earlier, there is no reason to believe that emerging reproductive technologies will fare any better, which is precisely why I thought I would bring up the notion of an expanded adjudicatory blueprint, which would go beyond the conventional scientific regulatory review of safety and efficacy, complementing it with an independent ethical review, such as to address the ethical element, and with a form of participatory public engagement or public consultation to address societal concerns such as they exist. I will say at the very outset that this is all very much work in progress. At the same time, it's important to recall that emerging reproductive technologies are coming at us fast and furious. And ignoring them is going to end up placing us in familiar territory. And more importantly, will deprive individuals in need of certain forms of care from accessing such. We would probably do well to pick mitochondrial replacement therapy, or MRT for short, as our case study of an emerging reproductive technology, which would also allow us to compare and contrast events in the United Kingdom and the United States. Those of you who are interested in this area may also find it of use to look at some recent reports on this subject, which I will get to in just a minute. But before we enter the arena of adjudicatory paradigms, a few words about mitochondrial DNA diseases appear in order. As most members of this audience almost certainly know, mitochondrial DNA diseases are rare diseases that are attributable to mutant mitochondrial DNA. The children so affected are frequently bedridden. At other times, they may be wheelchair-bound. And all too often, they are oxygen-starved. As you also know, some of these children succumb at a relatively early age after an agonizing course. Regrettably, cure is not presently in the cards, and PGD has been deemed unreliable, which leaves us essentially with prevention as the only option by way of mitochondrial replacement therapy, which conceptually speaking is a simple-minded notion that calls for the substitution of mutant mitochondrial DNA in affected oocytes and zygotes with wild-type mitochondrial DNA from unaffected oocytes and zygotes, courtesy, of course, or through the intermediacy of IVF. The United Kingdom has embarked on an expanded adjudicatory blueprint to legalize mitochondrial replacement therapy in 2000 and concluded the process in 2015. A recent book, which saw press in 2018, now summarizes most of that saga for those of you who wish to read up on it. All along the way, the process was shepherded by the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority, which, as many of you know, is an executive agency that operates at arm's length from the Department of Health, and which by law has full jurisdiction on all matters IVF and embryo research. To ensure that mitochondrial replacement therapy is subjected to a thorough scientific review, the HFEA commissioned such only to realize that science is progressing quickly, which necessitated follow-up reviews on 2013, 2014, and even 2016, at the conclusion of which the HFEA broadly concluded that MRT may be cautiously adopted where inheritance of the disease is likely to cause death or serious disease, and where there are no acceptable alternatives. To ensure that mitochondrial replacement therapy are subjected to an independent ethical review, the HFEA commissioned the Nuffield Council to study novel techniques for the prevention of mitochondrial DNA disorders. That report was published in 2012 and broadly concluded that in light of the health and social benefits to living free from mitochondrial disorders, it would be ethical for families wishing to use MRT if they wish to do so. Lastly, the HFEA saw to it that a measure of public consultation takes place in the context of mitochondrial replacement therapy. To this end, the HFEA commissioned the Office of Public Management as project principal and Cardiff University as the project evaluator. In the subsequent several months, almost a year, 92 subjects partook in public meetings that took place in either London or Manchester. 7 patients or patient relatives participated in a patient focus group in London. 1,836 individuals responded to an online questionnaire. 979 individuals took part in face-to-face interviews at 175 randomly selected locations. And finally, 90 individuals partook in deliberative public workshops that took place in Newcastle, Cardiff, and London. At the conclusion of this process, the HFEA advised the UK government that there is general support for permitting mitochondrial replacement in the UK. Despite the strong ethical concerns that some expressed, ethical concerns are outweighed by the arguments in favor of permitting mitochondria replacement. Commendable as this public consultation clearly is, and for that matter, pioneering as it actually is, it did leave myself and others with some questions that I would like to go over ever so briefly. Can the views of circa 3,000 participants be seen as representative of the entire adult UK populace? Second, can the views of circa 3,000 participants be deemed to constitute a broad societal consensus which is generally stated to be the deliverable of public consultation or participatory public engagement? And lastly, can public consultation be scaled up to a level deemed national in its scope and representation? I will come back to these issues a bit later. I will note, however, that none of this was lost on the Nuffield Council, which in an unrelated report on genome editing and human reproduction issued in July of 2018, recommended the establishment of a separate body or commission independent of government, which would produce an understanding of public interests through promotion of public debate. In a word, the Nuffield Council could readily appreciate the absence of existing infrastructure and or funding for public consultation going forward, and recommended that that relative deficiency be rectified. We are certainly not doing any better in this context, a point to which I will come to later. On February the 3rd, 2015, MRT was approved by the UK House of Commons and 3 weeks later by the UK House of Lords. On March of 2017, the HFEA granted a clinical license only for limited clinical trials at the Newcastle Fertility Center. There are no news to report at this time, except to say that we all expect an infant to be born at some point, hopefully an infant that is disease-free, hopefully an infant that will remain disease-free after long periods of follow-up, which are planned and to be sure have been mandated. The United States, for its part, intentionally or otherwise, began to embark on an expanded adjudicatory blueprint as well in 2014, a process that is ongoing as we speak for reasons which will become apparent before too long. The scientific review of mitochondrial replacement therapy, which would traditionally be carried out by the FDA, seemed very imminent in February of 2014 when the FDA convened a two-day meeting in Bethesda titled Oocyte Modification in Assisted Reproduction for the Prevention of Transmission of Mitochondrial Disease or Treatment of Infertility. However, not all that long after that, Congress passed and the President signed into law a renewable rider, the relevant language of which read, "None of the funds made available to the FDA may be used to acknowledge a submission for research in which a human embryo is modified to include heritable genetic modification." As such, this rider precluded the conduct of any clinical trials of MRT under the watchful eye of the FDA, and by extension precluded at least the potential approval of this technology later down the line by the FDA. The last time this rider was renewed for the fourth time was in February of this year. As we speak, certain changes in the status quo are in effect underway, although we are going to have to wait and see how the dust ultimately settles. The United States did embark on and successfully complete an independent ethical review of mitochondrial replacement therapy, an effort successfully undertaken by the National Academy of Medicine, which reported its findings on February the 3rd, 2016, broadly stating that it is ethically permissible to conduct clinical investigation of MRT subject to certain conditions and principles. The one element of the expanded adjudicatory blueprint that has yet to be broached in the United States in any form at all is the element of participatory public engagement or public consultation, as it is referred to in the UK. And with your permission, I would like to dedicate the time remaining to a discussion of this notion with a full understanding that it is still very much work in progress. Specifically, I'd like to say a few words about the origins of this movement, if we can call it such, the tools that it might be making use of, and the deliverables it might, in fact, provide us with. Beginning with the origins of the notion of participatory public engagement, leaving aside for the moment the Greek philosophers, or for that matter, Thomas Jefferson, we can probably go back to 1967 and to Peter Bachrach's book, The Theory of Democratic Elitism, wherein he stated that to be a citizen is to be able to participate in decisions that affect oneself and one's community. However, in the context of science, the notion of participatory public engagement was probably born in the wake of the Asilomar Conference on Recombinant DNA, which took place on February 1975. As many members of this audience undoubtedly recognize, the Asilomar Conference was widely lauded as an example of self-regulation by scientists, and indeed it deserved those accolades. However, at the same time, the Asilomar Conference was also the subject of growing criticism based on the recognition that it was a meeting by experts only and by invitation only, not that the public was actively excluded, but public participation was limited and public attendance, to begin with, was relatively negligible. One of the most vociferous critics of the Asilomar Conference from that point of view was the late Senator Kennedy, who that very year, in a speech to the Harvard School of Public Health, had the following to say: "When science develops techniques that fundamentally change society, society has the right to determine how the technique is to be used, whether it should be developed in the first place, and if so, under what constraints." This worldview received an additional plug in 1985 by Professor Schrader Frechette, who in her book Risk Analysis and Scientific Method offered that elevating technocratic orientation is to disenfranchise the public, who in a democracy ought to control that policy. A National Research Council report concerned with environmental assessment in 2008 stated that public participation is intrinsic to democratic governance. Lastly, perhaps one of the most able advocates of participatory public engagement, Sheila Jasanoff of the Kennedy School of Government, argued in her 2012 book, Science and Public Reason, that the issue is no longer whether the public should have a say in technical decisions, but how. And in that respect, she is obviously exceptionally on point in the sense that the how may well be the most practical, problematic element of the equation. Which brings us to this very matter, that is to say, the tools that might be deployed to probe the public, to give the public an opportunity to opine, to participate, to be edified in every possible way. Much of this plunges us knee-deep into the field of political science and into the notion of government by the people, and quite frankly, as we speak today, raises more questions than answers. And yet, I think it's essential that the matter be raised and debated. In the interest of time, I will limit myself to one such tool that has evolved and has received relatively wide recognition. It falls under the term deliberative democracy, a term that was introduced by Professor Lipsett in a 1980 book titled How Democratic is the Constitution? A notion that was nurtured by Jürgen Habermas and John Rawls in 1962 and 1971 respectively, and a notion that was operationalized by James Fishkin in his 1991 book, Democracy and Deliberation. Dr. Fishkin, who is a political scientist at Stanford, introduced a tool known as deliberative opinion polls. Deliberative opinion polls are a combination of conventional polls plus public deliberation sessions with a randomly selected representative sample of the public. This received a great deal of attention and at present is widely deployed both stateside and internationally. It tends to be logistically demanding and, by extension, resource intensive. It does not appear to have been applied thus far to a science-specific or a science-related topic, but that may well be just a matter of time. And of course, more information on that will become available before too long. Lastly, perhaps a word or two about the deliverable, which I mentioned earlier is what some are referring to as a broad societal consensus. This is, in a final analysis, a very difficult term to define. We know enough to say that consensus is not unanimity, is not plurality either. If it is anything, it is some sort of ill-defined common ground. But the quantification thereof is a point of debate. Commendable, a deliverable, as a consensus may well be, it would be perfectly reasonable to wonder whether such is in fact attainable in a nation such as the United States, although we could pick any other nation, except that, of course, in the United States we have some unique features that would not be duplicated elsewhere. What about our population size, which would require as many as 330 million of us to be polled, or maybe 250 million adults? A country with demographic diversity probably like no other, a nation with sectarian heterogeneity probably also unmatched, a nation that ethically diverges on a number of issues, and perhaps last but hardly least, the reproductive rights debate, which intervenes in any and all matters reproduction in this nation. And so, as we stand here today, it is difficult to predict with any degree of certainty that an expanded adjudicatory blueprint will in fact become a reality, one that would go beyond the conventional scientific regulatory review, that would incorporate an independent ethical review, but more importantly, will engage in some form of participatory public engagement. I will conclude by simply making the plea that in the meantime, we at least accept the notion that participatory public engagement be treated as research in progress, be tagged as multidisciplinary, which it is, be deemed worthy of funding because that is always necessary, and if at all possible, acted upon expeditiously because, as I said earlier, there is no time to lose. You don't want to respond when the news hit the press. When Science magazine published the next breakthrough in vitro gametogenesis or whatever other emerging reproductive technology, that's the wrong time to intervene. We want to act in an ante hoc rather than post hoc fashion if we have learned anything from history. It's a hard lesson to learn, and we have yet to apply it. But I would strongly recommend that we take it to heart and that we develop the kind of research and learned effort that would bring this possibility at least close to, if not to, actual reality. Thank you very much for your attention this afternoon. Be happy, of course, to entertain any and all questions. Take off my glasses so I can see into the distance. And I believe there are microphones for those who wish to use them.
Comment on how the change in abortion throughout the states in the last couple of weeks will impact on reproductive issues?
I think the question was whether the recent acceleration of the reproductive rights conflict, what effect might it have? One cannot help but feel that from a point of view of the issues we discussed today, this will set us back even further. This is the wrong way to go, no matter which side you're on. It is probably long overdue for some serious effort at accommodation, if I may say so, reconciliation, efforts at mutual recognition of views that may not be reconcilable, and if at all possible, live and let live, as opposed to try and force your position on everybody else. So I can't help but feel that this is not advancing the cause of this particular discussion, nor the cause of the national discourse. I wish I could say otherwise, but I think that would be folly.
We discussed it briefly yesterday, but
Konstantin.
yeah, we discussed it briefly yesterday, but maybe a commentary on the mitochondrial spin-off technology that's being used.
I think Konstantin is mentioning a case that transpired in the United States in 2016, whereby a New York-based clinic carried out mitochondrial replacement therapy, but ended up transferring the embryo in Guadalajara, Mexico. That particular undertaking was a clear effort to circumvent extant law at the time, which ended up receiving a cease and desist letter from the FDA. I don't condone those types of activities, even though I can see why that came about. The notion that constraints in one country produce medical tourism in another is, of course, a well-established one. And that's one of the risks you run when a moratorium is placed in a given nation and precludes the citizens of that nation from accessing a technology. We will have to wait and see how all of this evolves, but I believe that is the incident that you specifically are referring to.
What power does the FDA have if he would not comply?
I cannot speak to it from a pure... The question was, what authority, legal authority perhaps, would the FDA have, assuming the practitioner in question were not to comply? And while I cannot say this with certainty or with any legal expertise, I suspect that that clinic will be facing some federal lawsuit. And I also suspect that this clinic sought legal advice at the time. And I'm again guessing that its legal advice was to cease and desist indeed, which they did. And I don't really think that that advanced the cause of mitochondrial replacement therapy. As much as I would like to see the prohibition lifted, I cannot condone going the way that this particular effort underwent. I'm sorry.
I just have one more question. When the mitochondrial transfer, when the English are successful and have 3 or 4 successful babies born from this technique, will that change the climate in America?
So the question was, might success in the UK change the political and other climate in the United States? That's clearly been mentioned multiple times as a possibility. I suspect it will have some effect. But if you take into account that the original writer was justified on pro-life grounds, that I'm not sure will change. So to some people, it might change their mind, but to others, it might not. So there will be probably an effect, but will it be sufficient to move the political needle to where American at risk for mitochondrial disease can in fact look forward to the day when they can have this procedure in the United States? I'm not sure.
Dr. Adashi, thank you for that. You talk about the need for public discourse, and you compare the U.S. and the U.K. In the U.K., they had this special regulatory body. Who would be that counterpart in the U.S.? And if there isn't currently one, do you think we need to have something like that here in the U.S.? Thank you,
Barbara. The point's obviously well taken and familiar to anybody in the reproductive arena. The United Kingdom took a series of steps after the birth of Louise Brown, which began with the creation of the Warnock Commission, which developed what ended up being the UK policy on assisted reproduction from there onwards. Law was passed in 1990 and revised in the early 2000s. And it's that law which governs everything IVF and embryo research in the United Kingdom and makes it a rather orderly circumstance. In the United States, as you know, perhaps in the spirit of rugged individualism, perhaps in the spirit of capitalism, whichever other principle you may wish to imagine, we developed a freewheeling system, absent, shall we say, a single oversight organization. That said, it's not an unregulated field in that it is overseen by the FDA, or certain parts of it are. It isn't seen by CMS, certain parts of it are. And so we clearly have evolved very differently than the United Kingdom. Would we like to see an HFEA-like structure in the US? I think you'll get very different answers from a whole lot of people. I probably would not be opposed to it. I don't know that it's indispensable or essential, but the political likelihood of this happening at this point, I would rate as highly limited. And so, desirable or not, this would require very heavy lifting that I just don't see happening. Please. Hello.
Thank you, Dr. Adashi, for a great talk. So I was wondering if you could share some of your thoughts about what if we have this deliverable of a public consultation? Let's say we have a consensus. How do you move from this consensus, from this public deliberation to actual policy? Should it directly translate, or should there be some other steps in between? And what would those look like?
Excellent point, of course. Assuming one can arrive at a consensus, and we already discussed the limitations of the term and its achievability, I think that would have to be taken into account. Is that going to change minds in Congress, for example, to lift a moratorium? Again, it's difficult to predict. But it's necessary, nevertheless, to have that information and to be in a position to articulate it to our lawmakers. As long as we remain a representative democracy, and I certainly hope we will, then that will be where some of these decisions will ultimately be made. So whether or not it will carry the day, whether or not it will carry the day tomorrow, if it were achieved yesterday, I obviously don't know. But absent such, we just don't have the kind of public input that political representatives respond to, or might respond to, because it's not a given.
Ellie, a great talk, and as somebody who's known you for a number of years, it's just wonderful to see how you've brought your thoughtfulness and scholarship to this next chapter of your career. But I had a kind of specific question. You began by talking about what is in many ways a simpler situation of how FDA approves drugs that at least doesn't have the overlay of the exceptionally controversial areas that are relevant for reproduction. Over the past few years, I've had the opportunity to see a number of FDA advisory committees and listen to the public comment. And I found that it often raises some really very challenging issues. Typically, the FDA is focused on data, say, comparing the average benefit or average efficacy to the average risk, and they will reach a binary decision, either thumbs up or thumbs down. And one sometimes hears absolutely impassioned talks from patients, for example, about how they understand the risks and they're in a hopeless or very challenging situation and they desperately want options, and make essentially a libertarian argument that they understand the risks, and who is the FDA to say they shouldn't be able to take those risks. And this has arisen, with Duchenne muscular dystrophy drugs recently, with some type 1 diabetes drugs, and perhaps most recently with the sort of looping for where there's homemade closed loop systems where the FDA scolded people for using them essentially. So I guess one of the things I've struggled with is how do you deal with this issue of the FDA trying to make policy decisions based on average data and their understanding of benefit versus risk versus how this may look to an individual person who's suffering with what is in some cases a fairly hopeless situation. And it's never been entirely clear to me how to balance those two.
Thank you, Simeon. You raise many important issues, and I'll try to do them justice. The public session during the expert advisory committee meeting, often in the afternoon, tends to be time limited. And although anybody can register to speak, they don't have a whole lot of time to dedicate to that. And it's difficult to characterize those selective articulations as representative of the public or as reflective of public consultation or participatory public engagement. They are, I think, very important forms of exercise of democracy. I think it's required by law that these deliberations be done in the open. In fact, any federal committee or commission is required since 1972 or 3 to conduct its deliberations in public. And I think that's very good. But it's not quite the same as public consultation. I happen to be a fan of the FDA, and I think they are the oldest consumer protection agency that we have, with some significant records to display. You may or may not have seen the paper we published 2 weeks ago in Science, where we called for enhanced independence for the FDA, but mentioned the political interference and interjections over history in some of those decisions. And so the FDA is not perfect, and certainly not immune from political interference, nor should it be entirely isolated. But as institutions go, I think on the whole, I find it to be more positive than negative on the national scene. I don't think the FDA can always be blamed for, as you put it, I think, binary decisions, because they sometimes also add so-called REMS, which would require which would place a lot of constraints on the post-approval process, significant reporting and follow-up, for example. And so I think they have a variety of options at their display, this being just one, short of just a yes or no approval. And yes, they're dealing with shadowy, difficult decisions. And we probably don't have the time necessary here to go into the fine points of all of that. But I think as these limitations go, I generally tend to side with the FDA, looking in the long run, looking at its overall record, not this decision or that decision. Everybody makes mistakes, and that includes the FDA. But on the whole, there's nothing else that stands between us and thalidomide. It is the FDA. Sorry.
Thank you. That was an outstanding discussion. Your point about an anti-hoc, the use of anti-hoc, I think is a critical thing to think about. If we think about the world we all live in now and what happens post-hoc, particularly with everything, with the internet and the way media outlets pick up on things, and they become transformed into instantaneous cures. Of course, there's a great body of scholarship. I'm sure you're familiar with Timothy Caulfield in Canada, and similar scholars who look at scientific hype and how the predominance of articles, news bits, everything just feeds on itself to be primarily positive, transformative, cure, and we've been through this with stem cells. We want to go anti-hoc to try to have meaningful public engagement discussions and be inclusive of many different. We also don't want Senator Kennedy type recrimination that we're being secretive and not getting it out there. How will we balance the meaningful discussion without the hype taking us to places we don't want to be? Yeah,
I think you're raising excellent points again, and for which there is no single or absolute answer. I think history is littered with examples of post hoc reactions to discoveries. We could go back to Galileo and many examples ever since, wherein we wait until the discovery is made, it is published in Nature or Science, and of course it will be frontline news with the Washington Post, the New York Times, the LA Times, etc. And at that point, every politician and his or her staffer are of course on the case, and much depends on really their worldview and how they are going to process the news and act on it. This leads to knee-jerk reactions, to moratoria that are claimed to be time-limited but often become permanent or quasi-permanent, and we've had multiple examples of that in reproduction in the United States. We have the Dickey-Wicker Amendment, for example, that is now 40 years old. That is religiously renewed year in, year out. And so I think we have to be anticipatory as much as possible. And what we have said in a series of papers is, or defined it as the deliberation imperative, and it's a deliberative imperative here and now, as opposed to in the future. And there's no absolute reason that would preclude us from doing so, but it will be a departure from past practices. It might require an infrastructure. And by the way, to go back to the FDA, it is not in the remit of the FDA, for example, to study ethics. And that's why they would fund the National Academy of Medicine to do that. But the FDA has increasingly entered the field of public consultation. They have, in fact, a collaborative public engagement initiative that is small but could potentially be enhanced given the budget. We have a variety of other ways by which to capitalize on federal resources, whether it's the Federal Register or the like. The only problem with relying on the federal government on this matter is that we probably don't want to get it in the middle of it because they ultimately have to make a decision. So just like the Nuffield Council suggested, what we're looking for is as much as possible an unconflicted, independent entity that we could all feel good about, that we feel is not biased, hopefully one way or the other, hard as it may be to convince anybody in this cynical environment. And so, easy it's not, but avoiding it or burying it under the rug, I think would be just as bad a mistake.
Let's have Dr. Gordon ask the last question.
Ellie, I knew Mort Lipsett very well.
Yes.
And I know that he would be very pleased, knowing the wisdom that he imparted on this institution, that these difficult questions that you're addressing, that he would be very supportive of the kinds of things you're doing, and he would certainly hope, and certainly the things that he brought to bear would help resolve some of these difficult issues. And I know that he would hope that science would be an important driver of that effort. So thank you.
Well, Phil, thank you for coming, and it's great to meet you in person, not just over the phone. I remarked to one of Konstantin's fellows today who was struggling with a case of Cushing, that if there was any way to bring to life a concilium that would include Mort Lipsett, maybe Grant Little, and a few living luminaries, we could perhaps solve the problem of this young woman who seems to have a rather challenging situation. So yes, more often than not, I wish we had an emerging technology that would bring back people like Mort and his like, because they don't make it like that anymore. And that is an unfortunate situation. So thank you for bringing this up.
Well, I think if Mort Lipsett is listening to us, he's very happy out there. We are delighted that you made the time to come here. We are honored, privileged to have you here. And on behalf of everybody at the NIH, thank you so much for giving the 21st lecture on Lipsett's memory.
My pleasure.
Thank you all.